Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another EarthUP Live session. We're doing Food Waste Month this month, as you know, on the platform. And so as part of that, we have brought in a very special, very brilliant, but slightly unexpected guest, Samantha Kenny. Samantha's coming to us from the World Wildlife Fund. And if you're not quite sure what the World Wildlife Fund has to do with food waste, stay tuned for more. Stephen, do you want to introduce us to Sam?
Yeah. Thank you, Sam, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. Sam is the Senior Program Officer at the World Wildlife Fund for food waste. Sam and I met during another nonprofit group called The Wave, really trying to talk to big organizations about how to reduce their environmental impact and how to involve local communities. And Sam came in there, gave a great presentation, and that's kind of how we got introed.
Sam, so you know, we had teased the reveal for about like 2 seconds. Let's just spoil the reveal, right? Like, how is the World Wildlife Fund related to food waste?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Hunter. Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm really glad to be chatting with you and for the whole EarthUP community today. I'm excited to pull back the curtain a little bit on food waste. So, World Wildlife Fund is an old and famous organization, a science-based conservation nonprofit. We work across the globe in the most sensitive natural areas around the world. And we're most famous for our work, you might know us from our work on wildlife, species preservation, climate, even some of our work with oceans. But actually our most recent body of work is focused on food. And that's because World Wildlife Fund within the last decade has understood the really profound impact that food production has on our natural systems and some of the most delicate ecosystems and communities in the world. So because of that, they really zeroed in on the topic of food production and consumption. So how we can really think about sustainability and preserving natural resources, all the way from producing food at the farm or in a fishery, all the way through what it takes to get food onto your plate, and then what might happen with food that is left over at the end of a meal. So we really run the gamut, and there's a huge amount of natural resources embedded in food production. So I'm happy to dive into a lot more on that.
So yeah, I mean, obviously some wildlife ends up as our food, right? Like the fish that are in the oceans, we eat those wild fish. And so that connection's pretty clear. And then on land, a lot of what happens, right, is that we're chopping down rainforests to grow soybeans or cows or whatever. And obviously we want to feed the people on the planet, right? But food waste is much, much larger as a problem than people realize, right? And if that food wasn't wasted, then it would be potentially wild space, right?
Absolutely.
So how much food is wasted? Just to give us a sense of, like, if we didn't waste food, how much more wild space would be there on the planet?
Yeah, it's a really tremendous amount. So the majority of land on Earth is actually used to produce food. And the majority of fresh water on Earth is used to produce food, as is soil, the most chemicals, the most energy. All of these things are really embedded in it. And that's a really wild, some wild statistics in the scope of food production, but it's even crazier because we're actually wasting up to 40% of all of the food that we grow, which of course, if it's a huge waste, but it's also a huge opportunity. If we were able to secure even a small portion of the food that's currently lost or wasted in the system, we would be able to redirect it. We would to feed community members, to have more efficient systems. So it would really change the game on concepts of equitable food distribution, food security around the world. It's really profound.
Right. And also, I mean, you know, I've heard this stat that if food waste were a country, it would be the size of China. Right. So one way to even think about it is that if we didn't waste any food, potentially the whole of China or an area that size would be a national park. Right. That's one way to think about it. Right.
Very significant.
Great. And then also, I mean, you know, because you also touched on, like, it seems like food waste also touches on a lot of the different parts of what the World Wildlife Fund's mission is, right? And specifically, I mean, you know, you talked about climate change. So help thread that needle for us and help us understand the connection between climate change, food waste, wildlife. How do all those things fit together?
Yeah, absolutely. So climate change is threatening ecosystems and communities across the world. So conservation professionals like me, but experts all across these systems, are all thinking about the most strategic levers we can pull to reduce the amount of carbon emissions coming from our systems, and also to take carbon that's currently been emitted and now recapture it. And that's really very necessary to keep our sea levels from rising, or rising at the level of severity that can really threaten so many ecosystems and communities. And I think, we think often of energy or transportation sectors and these types of drivers for carbon emissions, but actually food is a huge source of carbon emissions. Carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, really, that run the gamut. So we might be thinking, there's the obvious emissions coming from the food sector, which is that we're driving food all around the world. We're shipping food across the planet, across boundaries, using planes, trains, and automobiles to get food from one place to another, because strawberries aren't in season over here and we want these different things. So that's a huge aspect of emissions. But there's also, think about all of the systems at play on a farm, systems at play on a ship. There are so many energy sucks throughout the system. Really, every step is a really huge emission. But even more than that, then you get to, say, a commercial kitchen or your own home. You're putting energy into keeping that food at quality in your fridge or your freezer. You're spending energy preparing that food and serving it, washing the dishes. And beyond that, if you end up throwing food in your trash bin, a bin that ends up being sent to a landfill, when food is thrown away in a landfill, it actually gets sealed in a way that it can't decompose the way you might have seen like an apple rot on your countertop. It decomposes without oxygen, which means it becomes methane. And this is actually a hugely significant source of methane in the world. Turns out food production is responsible for about 24% of our carbon emissions, at least. And there's all of these little intersections with other systems that we're seeing a lot of emissions being driven from food and food-related sectors.
So what I love about this is that these really simple choices that I make every day in my home, in my kitchen, have these huge global ramifications, right? And essentially food waste is one of those things, like so many parts of climate change, it feels like we can argue about, right? But who's in favor of wasting food? Like nobody wants to waste food. Our grandmothers have been telling us that forever. So, it seems like it might be a place that we can really rally around. And I think it's so smart of the WWF to have focused on that as a really strong lever for moving our behavior. But Stephen is going to dig into the food waste topic. As the dad of two daughters, he has to manage a much more complicated kitchen than I do.
I think a lot of people right now are wondering, what is considered food waste? What are the scraps? What is food waste? Do you want to dive in there?
Yeah, I'm happy to get a little nerdy for a second about language.
Please.
But these things are so important. So we know what we're all speaking about. So you might have heard really two terms when it comes to food waste. And the whole term is food loss and waste. So what's food loss? What's food waste? And what does this mean in my kitchen? So basically, food waste can be an over-encompassing term that really talks about any food that was grown to feed people that didn't end up feeding people. We're failing to make the most of something that we've grown. But food loss, it's a little bit more specific. When we're talking about food loss, we're really talking about food that's being wasted earlier in the supply chain. So food that is being wasted at the farm or the production level, all the way through logistics systems until it reaches like a consumer outlet. So food all the way up to a grocery store, all the way up to a restaurant, or all the way up, all the way up to a grocery store or restaurant where you might be getting your food and then taking it home to prepare or eat. Food waste, on the other hand, exactly, is things that are coming out of your kitchen. It's food that is spoiling in your refrigerator, or in maybe you have a meal kit box that you left at your front desk for too long and it's all melted all over the place. And so that would be food waste already. And it's also things that are left over on your plate. And this can include things like inedible parts, things like bones, and other things that maybe made you scratch your head if you had a backyard composter for the last few years. What can go into it? That's food waste too, because normally we can make a lot of delicious food out of items we might have previously thought were not edible, like watermelon rinds, for example, are delicious, and we think they just have to go in the trash. But there's a lot of really creative ways you can use inedible parts. So that counts too. It's really anything that has a little more value we could have squeezed out of it before it heads to the landfill.
So it's food loss is kind of like getting to the end consumer, right? Whether that's at a restaurant, at a household, at a hotel. But food waste is once it gets to the end consumer, how are we using it? How are we maximizing it? How do we not let things spoil, specifically if they've traveled a long distance? One of the most common things in our house that spoils is avocados, right? We're not buying avocados in Seattle. So something I thought was really, really interesting is Project Drawdown just came out talking about how households can really reduce their impact. And the number one thing wasn't solar panels or electric vehicles. It was actually reducing food waste. So on top of that, how much money is lost from food loss and food waste? Do you have any numbers estimated there?
Yeah, it's a really it's a huge amount. So the easy number that we can really make this very real for ourselves and our families is the average American household wastes over $1,500 worth of food right off their grocery bills every year, which is a really significant amount of that money could go a long way for buying more food, buying higher quality food and these things. At the scale of our global food system, it's really astounding. And it can also be really hard to quantify exact numbers in the hundreds of millions of dollars order of magnitude for food waste in systems around the world. But it's even hard to quantify how much value is in food that could have fed a person who really needed it, who then did not have access to it. It's really a profound loss, and one that's really hard to put a number on.
So in your job, what are some of the areas that you've been able to say, hey, this is where our focus should be? What are the low-hanging fruit to start the whole process?
All right. Well, and none of this is small potatoes either. So we took a look more than 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago now. The director of my program, Pete Pearson, reflected on a document put out by ReFed. ReFed is a really amazing US-focused NGO working on food waste. And they created a roadmap, basically, that quantified food waste in the US and then the key drivers of food waste along the system. So the team at WWF reflected on this data and how it really touched on WWF's priorities and positioning, and felt that they had to be talking about food waste post-harvest, food loss at the farm level. And also they had to be thinking about consumer-facing businesses. They found that 40% of food waste was coming from consumer-facing businesses like restaurants and hotels. And then a similar amount was coming from households. But WWF isn't actually very well positioned to work in households in the US. We just tend to work better with governments and companies. If you are interested in a little bit more on household food waste initiatives and resources, I would recommend NRDC's Save the Food. I think it's savethefood.org. It's a really amazing set of resources. They've got a guesstimator that helps you understand how much food to buy when you're having friends over. But basically, WWF entered this from a perspective of farms and production and consumer-facing businesses. I was hired on 5 years ago to tackle consumer-facing businesses. And savethefood.com, thanks, that's perfect. I always mix up .org and .com in our area of work. I'm sure people can relate. And when it came to consumer-facing businesses, we started with hotels because hotels employ a critical mass of food service workers, and they also serve a critical mass of diners. So we felt we could really take a big bite out of the problem. And since then, we've been working really ambitiously with the hotel sector to really tackle this as it is most important for their business, for the planet, and also for the communities where they work.
And do you help educate those businesses too, like what they can do with the food if they've already have the food, they've already made the food, and before they throw it in the compost? Because I know there's still methane that comes out even if you do compost, correct?
Absolutely true. The most important thing you can do when trying to reduce your negative impact by thinking about food waste is to prevent it. There's no amount of composting or any other secondary system that can bring about as much benefits as just preventing the food waste will. So with all of the things we approach, we come with a prevention first mindset. Reduce every bit of food waste that you can, maximize it to its greatest extent. But if it's not possible to prevent food waste, and it's never possible to get to absolute zero, it's really important, especially in the case of a large food service operation that's getting a huge volume of food. It's really important for them to be very close with their local community partners, to be talking about how they can rescue quality surplus food to make sure it's feeding community members instead of going into the trash. And then, so importantly, if food waste can't be prevented through on-site reduction or through a donation program, it's really important you're not sending it to landfill whenever possible, that you're able to compost it or otherwise process it so it can still give some value back to the system. So we do work with hotel properties, cruises, and really consumer-facing businesses across the board on prevention, donation, and food waste diversion. And all of those strategies are really importantly underpinned by separation and measurement. You have to take food waste out of your general garbage bin to have any idea what you're wasting, how much, and why. And only from that can you start figuring out, okay, I can prevent this. Maybe a donation partner can help me here. And definitely let's get that composter going too.
That's great. There's also additional money outside of what you talked about. We ended up downsizing our trash bin because we have a big yard waste thing that we can actually throw compost. We have a great composting facility out here too. So there's other ways you can save money outside of just the food waste, right? We pay less money to send less trash to the landfill, which is pretty cool. And I'm sure that's true for hotels you're working with, convention centers, all those big businesses.
It totally is. It really does depend on the locality. And this tends to be a really tough nut for an organization like mine to crack, because I can't sit from my desk in New York or Washington, D.C. and say something that's going to be relative for you in your homes in Seattle or in Denver and all of these different communities with different opportunities. So instead, we can really only give high-level guidance, which is that there might be opportunities to save money by going with a composter. In some cases, in some localities, like New York City, for example, it's actually more expensive to throw food waste in a landfill because it's being subsidized. But I'll mention, like, the EarthUP platform is so perfect for a topic like this because there's a lot of localities that offer benefits for folks that are interested in setting up composters on their property, rebates, incentive programs, pickups, opportunities to sell compost back. So really take a look at what your local community offers. And I would just say, pick up the phone and start talking to folks too, because you end up finding some cool nerds that like to talk about local food systems and local food sustainability. And that's where it really comes to life.
Another group, like you said, really thinking locally. Another group that's pretty amazing is Buy Nothing. If you have half a loaf of bread that you're not going to use, you can post that stuff on Buy Nothing, and another family in need will come pick it up, which is pretty cool. So something, and I know this time of year, it's really important to think about our food waste. We just had Thanksgiving. We're coming up on Christmas. Something that I've done personally is really started, we have a crock pot. All the different things that you can throw into a crock pot after you smoke your turkey and make stock. And it's actually extremely rewarding once you start that process. Once you start actually doing it, it seems like I didn't for the longest time make any stock. And then finally I did it. I was like, that's all, right? And so it's just that small little action that you have to take that actually can change a lot and actually help reduce a lot and save some money. Hunter, do you want to jump into the next section about food and hunger?
Hunger. Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, Stephen, about stock, Samantha, you alluded to this, but our grandmothers and grandfathers did not throw away anything, right? I mean, they reused the bones to make broth. They reused all the parts of the vegetables. Like, there was a great email that I was sent by Italy, and they were basically talking about your pumpkin, right? Because normally we sort of use it as a decorative thing and it's food and we throw it away. And they were like, you can do this with the seeds, you could do this with this. And then the thing that they had the toughest time with was the stem, right? That hard, knotty stem. But they dug through a bunch of old cookbooks, Cucina Povera, like the cooking of poverty. And it turns out there were old Italian recipes for even cooking the stem of a pumpkin, right? So a lot of it is an opportunity to reconnect with traditional ways of cooking and practices and everything else, because it turns out our ancestors knew a thing or two about stretching every scrap of food as far as it could go.
Absolutely. I think that, just to jump off that, guys, because it's a really important and poignant notion really to discuss. I think one of the biggest things you can do to start combating food waste at home is just taking a look at your food a little bit differently. I think it's so easy for us to go to the store and pick up anything we like, and it's a little low quality or it tastes a little funny, and we throw it away and we're not really thinking about it. I'd say, like, my favorite Thanksgiving side is the sandwich you make the next day, and that was always a big plus for me. But it's really poignant what you're mentioning here, that nothing used to go to waste in communities.
Yeah.
I'd say that there's many food cultures all around the world, definitely indigenous food cultures and other cultures who have had to make the most of their food resources, that have always been cooking with efficiency top of mind. And that food culture, and really what we're doing when we're cooking is we're keeping ourselves alive. We're keeping our families alive. It's something, it's very human. It's really our natural state is to eat together and enjoy that. And when you can just look at your pizza and like twist it a little bit in your mind and say, this isn't like the pizza day of the week because I didn't want to cook and it's just super easy and it's junk food and things like that. Food is never junk. It's delicious, even when it's bad for you. And reframe it, it's a wonderful, it's something steeped in food culture, and it's steeped in a way that people have been feeding their families forever. And there just wasn't garbage in the way we think about it a few years ago. Everything went out to the back for the pigs and the dogs, and it's just the circle of life. And we have to kind of get back to that natural way of systems.
Well, and also, people used to really eat nose to tail, right? Like there's so many parts even of animals, right? Like ears, trotters, all of those things. And it's funny because that used to be the food of poor people, right? And then everybody sort of got really obsessed with their ribeyes and their T-bones and everything else. And now the hipsters have rediscovered what the peasants of yesteryear knew, which is that those are some of the most delicious parts of the animal.
Absolutely. And, a lot of the reasons we don't eat certain delicious things is just because of the nature of the food system that we have right now has focused on different items based on supply and demand and what's easy to ship around and what people buy when they see it on the shelves versus what might be very delicious or very sustainable to eat, or something that's really close to a food culture or someone's personal history. So I think we can even challenge ourselves, like, what do we think is icky and what do we think is, a normal dish to eat? And we can actually totally pick up on this trend we're seeing in gastronomy and culinary right now, which is trying things that are not as familiar to us, that do kind of stretch our palates a little bit. And it can both be sustainable and delicious, and it's a more authentic way of eating.
100%. And so to that end, let's talk about what our food system has created. So if you're talking about indigenous traditional food systems, right, obviously everybody in the community gets fed from what's available, right? But if we look at our global community, there are a ton of people going hungry or not having access to quality food and everything else. So what is the problem, right? Because we simultaneously are wasting all of this food and then having a ton of people who don't have food. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I'd be really happy to talk about that. And when it comes down to it, there's no easy way or easy summary to say that food systems don't work for everyone, other than to say food systems historically haven't worked for every member of a community. And that's not always by accident. In many cases, it's systems of power that have led to different communities having less access, or maybe less access to chosen foods, less access to foods of all types and quality, availability. We can think about food deserts. But absolutely. And hunger and food waste are topics that very closely intersect, because we're thinking of lost food or wasted food. And we're thinking of the folks that would have really benefited from having that food on their plate, or an opportunity to make the most of that food. But when it comes down to it, us eating the last slice of pizza because we didn't want to throw it into a landfill does not necessarily equate to our neighbors down the street ending up having enough food on their table. And this actually has to be really intentional. And I'd like to say the most important thing I can say about this is I'm not an expert in hunger. And I think that folks in the field, in conservation fields, in food systems, even in communities, should be thinking less about how we each can own every aspect of system change or every aspect of the solution, and more think about how we can bring our skills and expertise into a community that can really put their heads together and think about how we can make systems work for people first, for nature, and for our entire system and everyone it serves. So I'd say that it's a really nuanced problem, and there's not just one driver, but in many cases, there's many, many obstacles to securing food systems, and a lot of interests that stand in the way of really maximizing them for the benefit of everyone. And I'd also say, we were talking a little bit about indigenous food cultures and these other more thoughtful ways of eating and dining. And I'd say We also can't blanket statement over all indigenous food cultures to be perfect or different. Everything is completely unique. The way each culture approaches their food systems are really unique too. So I'd recommend, if there's a way of eating, especially if that way of eating is local to the land that you are living on, an amazing way to connect closer with your food is to connect with the folks that have cultivated that land and the folks that are innovating that cuisine or celebrating the traditional aspects of that cuisine. I can mention, Sean Sherman and Brian Yazzie are two amazing indigenous chefs that are amazing to highlight. So it's not for me, Samantha Kenny, to kind of raise up these points, but actually instead very important for each of us to take some time to shine a light on the foods we find delicious and the things that make us excited and also bring us closer together.
Absolutely. I mean, it's all of this stuff is so complicated, right? And none of us is smart enough to understand it all. But if we can create a dialogue of mutual respect, then we are capable of collectively figuring it out together. And fortunately, we live in a position where we have access to so many wonderful cultures, right? And there are so many great pieces to take from all of them. And if we can have that cultural exchange and that cultural dialogue, we can all figure out a culture that really makes sense for us in the 21st century with a complex global society. So to that end, right, you sort of, there's a little nugget in there that you hid, right? And I really just want to pick that out and really dig in on it. So you use this phrase, food deserts, right? Mm-hmm. So what are food deserts?
Yes. Well, I'm not going to be able to do the Oxford Dictionary rendition, and I would absolutely recommend folks interested in food equity and hunger topics to dive into this from the absolute experts. When we're talking about food deserts, we're talking about a lack of access to supermarkets, to food markets, basically a lack of access to quality nutritional food that will meet someone's daily nutritional requirements. And so I lived 8 years in DC. DC is very famous, a very famous food desert, where it's quite a small geographic area, but there's quite a huge population of historic DC residents that don't have close access to supermarkets. And it's not just physical proximity, it's also things about transportation and being able to get to and from the supermarket, whether or not quality fresh foods are available or just shelf stable foods. So I'm interested, of course, also to spend more and more time like getting really specific about the context of food deserts in each of the communities we activate in, and would encourage, again, anyone who's interested in the specifics and expert perspectives to spend time seeking that out.
But just to, bring that down and make it really simple for a dum-dum like me, right? Like, there's a big difference between walking into a 7-Eleven and the kind of food you can get there versus walking into a Whole Foods, right?
Exactly so. And actually, I'll mention that there's one historic approach to solving a food desert problem, which was actually working with convenience stores to install refrigerators, and then they could get kind of a produce route, a fresh food route. So the convenience stores could kind of also offer that fresh produce, very necessary aspect of increasing food security there. And it's just, it was one of those examples of a really fantastic idea. And then sometimes what you need is a lot of follow through and really to ground the way you're mending food systems in the actual needs and the actual demands of the community that they're serving, instead of maybe a one size fits all approach.
Right. And I think also part of it is that all of us need a ton of education on how to process foods, right? Like, obviously, if you're running a restaurant, there's a ton of education there on how to store fruits and vegetables, how to cook them, how to process them, everything else, right? And most of us don't necessarily know how to cook for ourselves very well or how to manage a kitchen.
Absolutely. I think, it would have been amazing to spend time learning how to, I lived alone for a few years after college. It would have been really wonderful for my education to have included just some basic home ec skills on how I could make myself something a little better than ramen, or how I wasn't having a whole half a loaf of bread rotting every day. Or even just having the right knives. You buy a watermelon and you don't have a knife to cut it. What's that watermelon going to do? So absolutely, even just some basic skills for how to safely prepare food in your kitchen, how to keep it at quality, what you should be storing on your counter versus what should be stored in the fridge. Save the Food is also a really good resource for that from NRDC that I'll ping again.
100%. And even just knowing how to process sell by labels and best before, right? Because a huge amount of food is thrown away because people look at the thing and they're like, I don't know, this thing may kill me. I'm going to throw it away when it may be perfectly safe to eat.
Totally.
Okay, I have one last question, then I'm going to hand you over to Stephen. Okay, how much do you think pop culture shapes our expectations of foods in unhealthy ways and contributes to food waste?
So the first thing that comes to mind with this question is like fad foods, like Instagrammable foods, or, the drink everyone wants to get to take a photo with it. And maybe they're not into the taste and thing. I think that pop culture can definitely drive these, Instagrammable moments, or, the rainbow bagel or something like this that could be delicious, and maybe 100% of them are eaten, but I'd say it brings out a lot of folks that are interested in the picture. And again, I think that's an awesome way to engage with food if you'd like to, but repositioning for a little, just placing a little bit more value on that food, and maybe just trying one with your group of friends. You can pass it around for the photos, and then someone can snack on it, whoever likes it. But I'd also say there's a real focus on like quick dining, and like quick cooking, and how fast can I get a meal on the table. And definitely I would not say there's a huge time crunch for folks cooking for their families, and there's picky eaters at the table. There's so many reasons why you might be wasting food at home. I think a lot of it at home, especially if you have the intention to reduce food waste, again, is just dialing into what you're preparing, thinking about what you might have thrown out previously. And even if you don't have a composter or an opportunity to compost, maybe just keep your food scraps in a bowl on your table or something like that. Because there's a big kind of throwaway culture where we just think, the second it disappears, it's gone forever. And I think that can be really reinforced by maybe cooking content online. I've also seen those crazy videos, maybe I'm just too deep in like cooking TikTok, where people are making nachos on their counter. And it's just like these food trends that if you're looking at them and thinking, is someone eating that? The answer is very likely no. And then the next question is, well, what's happening to it? So.
Yep. Excellent. Stephen.
So Sam, taking a step back a little bit, what is a day in the life of Sam when it comes to the World Wildlife Fund? What do you do? What's your focus? Would love to learn a little bit more.
Sure, I'm happy to. So as I mentioned, I came on the team a little more than 5 years ago. I was hired on as I was hired on as an intern. We were developing our guidance for the hotel sector. We were working with the American Hotel and Lodging Association. And I was actually hired to like put on gloves and go into a hotel kitchen and measure their food waste using like a luggage scale. And it was primary research for really some of the first, direct data capture from what was going on in the kitchen. From that, we ended up launching our guidance for hotels. And since, I've really been scaling the program. So now I serve as subject matter expert for addressing food waste in hospitality and food service businesses, both in their operations, but definitely in their corporate commitments and their corporate strategic plans, to make sure that leadership is really aligned to help folks on the ground be as successful as possible. But then a couple of years ago, given my work in the hotel sector, it's global in nature, I also ended up picking up extra responsibilities coordinating WWF's global team of staff that are working on food loss and waste across systems. So now I work a little bit more at the system scale, the 50,000-foot view, really thinking about what levers you can pull throughout a system to make more circular economies and to make the system work definitely for conservation outcomes, environmental outcomes, but with our partners, make it work first for people and the communities it serves, and then to meet all of our commitments aligned with the SDGs and things.
So you're in the hotels, literally having plastic gloves on, measuring food waste. Is there any interesting stories? What'd you guys find?
Well, I don't know if you know this about me, Stephen, but I have a superpower when it comes to this stuff. So I was actually born without a sense of smell. So I'm like a total guru with this stuff. What was always funny for me was I would, in some cases, was the first person that had like walked into their trash room from the culinary team, because chefs tend to have really sensitive noses. Chefs don't really love to look in their garbage because it's kind of stinky. And I was just like, the opposite of a chef, and they were just like, what, you can't taste my food, but you can, go through my garbage and teach us all these ways we can be more efficient. So again, the coolest thing back of house, and the coolest thing about this program when it touches down in a hotel kitchen, for example, is to watch all of these technicalities. Like, we're talking about statistics and like we're talking about operational changes, but when you get to a hotel level, you start seeing what the chefs are doing differently, the innovation they were able to find after years of doing the same menu. And it's just awesome to see like their eyes light up and say, oh, they're doing like a chopped cooking competition or something. And just the amount of creativity is really fantastic. And those aha moments when we all get a little bit out of our element. I ended up learning so much about culinary. I'm so grateful to the people that taught me. And I ended up getting to teach a few things about trash too.
Nice. Something, again, surfacing interesting insights. We recently had the head of sustainability for Lumen Field, the Seahawks, and they were talking about how they divert 94% of their waste from landfills, right? And a lot of it has it's been a thought process. The whole concept was actually surfaced from a loading dock manager who was like, hey, this is how you can reduce food waste. So so we know it can be done, but as you sit in your office and you're looking at planning systems, what are some of the ways, like the easy ways that we can just improve the existing systems from a 50,000-foot view?
Absolutely. So, everyone has a different opportunity. We all waste food like almost every day in a small way or another. And all of us have an opportunity to take a look at what we're doing, whether we are a chef serving 10,000 people a day in a convention center, or we're someone serving ourselves or serving us in a partner. We really get to think about it. And I'd say, if you're an individual, or if you're a business owner or staff of a business that works with food in a small way or a big way, the single biggest step you can take is just having some conversations with your community members, learning a little bit more about your local food system. And if your business is one that orders food, learning a little bit about where that food's coming from, learning about the suppliers, the producers, and then learning where it's going. Do you know where your landfill is? Do you know if your recycling is single stream or double stream? And getting a little bit interested or asking just a couple questions about what's happening upstream, what's happening downstream beyond our doors. It'll just get you introduced, like I said, to those food nerds who are able to tell you all about food security in your community, all about the most important aspects, the most important things you can do to make the most of your food as it's relative to the local opportunities. So I just say walk outside your door, go to a food policy council meeting. Normally most communities, especially metropolitan communities, if you're centered somewhere like that, and then also at the state level, will have a group that's really thinking about food systems and would have all of the resources that you're looking for. And if you do not have a food donation partner or food donation organization working locally, if you don't have a commercial composter, write to your representatives, write to your local government, because they're making decisions about zoning and services like community services like this all the time. And if they know that folks and businesses in their communities are looking for a way to make the most of food, they can see some benefits also in keeping that out of the landfill and really maximizing this for the community.
And at World Wildlife Fund, you guys created the hotel waste measurement methodology, really to help hotels, I imagine, to guide them to reduce their food waste. Do you want to explain that a little bit more?
Sure, I'm happy to. So back in 2017, we released Hotel Kitchen, which if you were to head to hotelkitchen.org, that is a comprehensive toolkit for how to address food waste in the hotel sector. And it's guidance that's organized by staff function, but also kind of chronologically from menu planning all the way through procurement and storage, preparation, service, and then donation and disposal. So that's our comprehensive guidance for hotels. We also have some guidance for restaurants, and you can find that at 86foodwaste.com. It's basically the same guiding tenets, but really just adapted a bit for the restaurant sector in the ways that it differs from hotels. So those resources have been out for a few years and have been tried, and we have case studies from examples of them out in the wild. But since then, we've really been working to fill data gaps. And one big gap we really needed to fill was how the entire hotel sector can measure waste in a consistent way, such that they can compare their progress apples to apples. So we ended up working with a partner, Greenview, and an amazing cohort of large hospitality hotel brands to develop this hotel waste measurement methodology. And it's super technical. It's basically about how a hotel should be separating waste, not only food waste, on their property in a way that can be the industry, like a common industry approach to waste separation and tracking. But on top of that, the intention is for properties to separate and measure waste similarly, but also for the brands or companies that are managing them to be able to compare all of their properties together, and then for us all to compare to each other. And this is also the mechanism that's going to help us be sure and confident that we are hitting and achieving something like SDG 12.3, which is the global goal to reduce food waste by half. The only way we can be sure that's happening is if we're measuring in a way that we're really confident in and we're setting strong baselines. So that's what that report is. It's the very technical way of how to measure waste and understand how that looks for a portfolio of hotels.
So as companies are trying to reduce their emissions, they go through a very similar process, right? They use the, a common framework is the GHG protocol to really figure out how to baseline. So that's essentially what you're saying. You guys are in the process of identifying how can all these different industries baseline their food waste so that they can actually have an apples to apples comparison and we can all see progress together. Is that correct?
Totally. And I'll actually say it's based heavily informed by what's called the food loss and waste protocol. And it's a way at really the top level that we should be talking about metrics around food loss and waste. And then this hotel waste measurement methodology grounds that in the reality of the sector.
Awesome. And then there's one other thing, the Zero Food Waste Act. Do you want to explain that a little bit to us too?
Sure, I'm really happy to. So I mentioned that I have a bit of a global role for my team in WWF, where I'm doing some global coordination of our work. I have my colleague, Alex, who focuses in on our work in the US specifically and really driving system change in the States, along with especially corporate partners and government partners too. So basically, and again, this isn't a piece of work that I'm managing, but I'm super proud of all of the progress that's been made. It's really amazing. So basically, Alex and team brought together a group, the Food Loss and Waste Action Plan, who ended up proposing a bill to Congress called the Zero Food Waste Act. And today, the Zero Food Waste Act, I don't believe it exists as a standalone as it used to. But aspects of it have been integrated into the Build Back Better bill, which is currently in front of the Senate. And that bill right now has two different buckets of $95 million each that is going to be spent out in the form of grants to communities for specific use, measuring and reducing food waste, and then also scaling food waste and materials recycling. So like composting and other materials recycling. And then some of the juicy stuff is this is actually influencing a lot of different acts and legislation. And this group is really getting together to think of different ways we can advance this type of policy. So included in the Food Donation Improvement Act, the School Food Recovery Act, and they're also reintroducing the Food Date Label Act. And we're also working to include our recommendations in the Farm Bill and the Child Nutrition Reauthorization. And the best news is that all of these things are actually pushed by a bipartisan interest, bipartisan interests in Congress. So we're actually seeing, just as you said at the top of the hour, that food waste is an area where a lot of people agree and are really interested in maybe making system improvements from that perspective together.
It's another way for us to find commonalities, right? In a time like this, it's extremely important. So when you're, as a WWF, are you guys really helping set up composting facilities? Like, are you guys trying to influence different policies? Because I'm sure you see that, the framework that we have and the resources that we have in different area varies a ton. So is that something that you guys are taking head on, or you leverage partners to help with that?
Well, both. So you hit the nail on the head there, Stephen. So we were originally thinking about how we can really push agenda setting. So how we can work collaboratively in an involuntary way to get companies and governments up to speed and working on these topics. But really, this will only scale and only scale as quickly as we need it to if it's going to be formalized through policy and formalized through active like system changes and active investment in infrastructure. So a few years ago, we would have said, well, we're focused on prevention. All of the benefits we're going to be able to gather from the environmental side are about preventing food waste. Then we learned so much more about the huge impacts of food coming from like food disposed in landfills. So we said, okay, this is an entire system. We also found that hotels had a really hard time separating and measuring food waste if they then had to mix it back in with other garbage and just send it to a landfill. Just didn't make sense to people. If it's so valuable, we have to measure it. Why am I putting it back in the trash? So it's actually a chicken and the egg type of situation where a community really needs a composter or a food waste hauler or another type of food waste processing vendor to help really solidify the value on preventing food up front, because we really need that insight into the waste stream to see it. So absolutely, WWF is working specifically in the US, all filtered through this, the effort I just mentioned with Congress. But in the US, waste management is a really unique topic that's super localized in perspective and really comes down to states and even more so localities. Like we recycle differently one town over from here. And it's something that I think we're going to just have to keep working on as a community in the US to make more and more consistent approaches to material recycling so we can actually make the most of the value that these materials have instead of everyone treating them differently and no one really knowing what to do.
That makes a lot of sense.
Well, also the good thing is there's a platform called EarthUP, which will allow you to create localized content to your zip code. So, that's part of what our job is in the meantime to make sure that people can find out exactly what's true in their community so they can connect with those resources. The other thing I want to say, just to, we're going to be opening this up to questions. So get ready with your questions, throw them in on either LinkedIn or on YouTube. But, before we do that, I just want to say, I'm so grateful for you, and I'm so grateful for the WWF. And obviously, I love a good panda or a good tiger as much as the next man, but it's really, really impressive to see how strategic you guys are about really thinking, what's an issue that we can have real impact with in a bipartisan way. And to be able to pull that off in the 21st century, amazing. There aren't many people who have figured out how to do that. So thank you.
We'll see. We're all doing it together. And thank you both so much. The idea of the local aspect of this work, it's really where the rubber hits the road. And we can kind of speak about theory and concepts all day long and agenda setting. But when it comes down to it, each of us have to make decisions every day in our homes and our jobs and our lives. And it's really all about the community you're in and the resources you have at your disposal. And it's only through a platform that can really make it that type of personal that this stuff can become really possible.
Well, and I think to that end, right, just to sort of connect all the dots, right, your home is a really, really good place to look at and understand the food waste problem in a way you can really track and conceptualize. And then as you learn those insights, you can then go and bring those insights to your place of work, to your community, to political action, to everything else, right? But change starts at home. That's a really, really good place. It's not that, at home you're going to necessarily fix the whole food waste system, but at home, you will learn about a lot of the problems so that you can then be more effective in asking for action.
So true.
Yep. Stephen, there's a question from Roy. Do you want to read it?
Yeah. Roy asked, how do you actually balance over-ordering for conference meetings versus under-ordering? In the event industry, it's normal to order about 20% more than they actually think that they actually need for the people. And so that was the question.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, very thoughtful. And I'm also casting my brain back to when we were at conferences and convention centers and those types of meals. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. So the first thing we found when we were really digging in on the meetings and event space is that in many cases, so kind of the system here is we have a client, say it's WWF, that is looking to cater an event. So they hire a meeting planner, and that meeting planner goes out and they might work with a hotel venue to secure that room, and the hotel will then support catering. So there's really 3 different stakeholders here. And it turns out that often the client overestimates how many people are coming to the meeting planner because they don't want to run out of food. Then the meeting planner overestimates on top of that to the hotel because they don't want to run out of any food. And then often the events staff in the hotel also overestimate when they're then communicating to culinary. So you end up really stacking on this overage. So it can be a really huge problem. So the first thing is just calling that out. When you're planning something with a meeting planner, say, listen, this is an accurate head count as far as I understand. It's really important that we communicate an accurate head count to the culinary team at the property because we don't want to be wasteful. We don't want to be paying for more than we need. And I think just kind of breaking down that wall and saying this used to be something that was kind of hush hush, and now let's just call it out and say we all want to get it right. That's a big question. And then a big point, you can make a quick change right away. But even bigger than that, I've been thinking about this concept recently about right sizing catering. So actually right now, almost every catering package in a hotel is customizable. So almost everyone gets to pick their own menu from the hotel's offerings. And each one of those menus then has maybe a 20% overage on top of it. But instead, if you sell a single menu for every meeting and event happening on premises that day, you can consolidate all of the overage and you can actually really cut down on waste just by serving a single menu. So we're thinking about starting a menu of the day type of catering initiative that really supports some of that. And then on top of it, we can also supply some really catchy phrases that we've designed specifically to make sure they're not off-putting to anyone, to actually bring guests into the conversation, because folks in a conference are not leisure travelers. These are people that are on the clock. They're there to work, and we don't need to, throw perishable snacks and free bottles of wine and all of these things necessarily at them. Instead, we can really maximize the value for, what folks are there to do that day, which is, be productive in one way or another, not producing food waste. So definitely, there's a lot of things you could do. The biggest point is just to start talking about it in explicit terms with the people you're working with.
And I think to that end, right, the second part of Roy's question, and just around the office, how can we improve our food waste around the office kitchen and Bagel Wednesdays, right? Mm-hmm. Part of it is that it's also a responsibility for the individual to communicate honestly, like, I'm going to be honest, I don't like your bagels. I'm not going to eat any of them, so don't order any bagels for me.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's amazing because we've all been there at the end of the morning meeting and everyone said they needed coffee and everyone said they needed a breakfast sandwich, and then people had their banana while they were walking in and everything. Again, I think this is something like we can do if we just kind of put some thought to it ahead of time. People tend to eat something. They're much more likely to eat something that they chose. So instead of getting, suggested mix of bagels, maybe put out a survey and say, what is your bagel order? We're going to have a bagel with your name on it there. They're much more likely to eat that. And then on top of it, if you do like a survey about your meeting or event, you can ask questions about the food service that are targeted. You can say, we don't want to keep buying you something you don't like. How did you feel about this vendor? And I think just putting a really fine point and also trusting people to be honest with their feedback. And if you give them the why are you asking me this? Like, I want you to give me lunch next time. So I'm not going to say, don't give me lunch. Like, if we have an open dialogue, we can really right size some of these things. We can also end up eating things we like better.
Awesome.
And to continue with that too, what is there real issues with, have you experienced when talking with people about running out of food? I mean, is that something? I've never been really at an event where they ran out of food, one of these all people meetings that you go to. Is that something that actually happens often? I've never experienced that.
I'm sure that folks in operations could tell some horror stories. And the biggest thing, the real breakdown is we do have to right size. We do have to right size our orders, because when something runs out, it doesn't tend to be the meeting planner and the chef that hear about it. It tends to be line level staff, one person who's clearing the plates, who now has to deal with this kind of confrontation about, we're out of rainbow bagels. They're my favorite. And so I think that it's really also, it's about communicating the point to every person there. A lot of folks at an event, if they're not seeing really even that, like if the dish isn't empty at the end of the meal, even if there's only a few left, people are like, ooh, it's stingy. Like, I don't want to be scraping the bottom of the barrel. I don't want to take the last rainbow bagel because maybe other people don't like it or didn't touch it. And often attendees will think that folks are looking to cut costs. in that, like, if a buffet is not abundant, they're like, oh, like they were trying to cut costs on culinary, which no one likes because everyone wants to think they're having an amazing dining experience. So it's really about telling the story and having the service folks working the buffet ready to talk about why it might not be full and it's not their fault, and really bringing everyone into the conversation and also getting everyone what they need, because we don't want people to go hungry either.
It's the feedback you talked about, right? Asking what they want and seeing if they got what they want, right? And then next time you do it, go through that whole process again to continue to refine, because it's not going to happen overnight.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Hunter. You want to take this question?
Well, yeah, I can. And I was just going to say, and making sure that they're bought into the mission, again, as you say, like, nothing pisses people off than feeling like they're being stiffed on food, right? But if on the other hand, you're like, hey, this is what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to prevent all this damage to the planet, right? And that's why we want to make sure that we get the ordering right and everybody has enough food and everything else. Then people understand why it's happening, and people are more than happy to be reasonable if they understand why things are happening, right? Yeah. Okay, so question from Tyra. Do you know of neighboring companies working together to pool resources to combat food waste? What are arguments we can make for cost sharing that's more palatable to executive leadership? So it seems like this is an opportunity for storytelling again.
Absolutely. So I do have some really amazing examples of neighboring companies, especially hotels around a community, hotels and convention centers, for example, working together to pool, especially for food donation programs. So very often for food recovery, there's a really underinvested portion of the food recovery chain, which is the transportation. So you have a food service operation that has food that's surplus, and you have a recovery organization working to serve their community. And those are very well functioning machines, but often it's the logistics between the two that break down. And that's why lots of donatable food doesn't end up donated. So when you're actually able to come together in a locality of operations, you have enough donatable food to make it really worth someone's while to get a van and make that route. And it's actually very similar for small scale composters. Many communities have a composter, but in many cases, their operations are quite limited. And they really might need to understand the demand from the business community before they invest in a larger unit or before they invest in a new route. So really having those conversations can actually make capacity where there was none previously. So if you can buddy up, especially if you're a hotel, for example, there's many local and state hotel and lodging associations. Most hotels are a member of one. And very often, if you reach out to someone at that association or someone in the local government, they'll be able to connect you, if you're not already networked in, with other hotels or restaurants or grocery stores operating in the area. And suddenly you can make a really meaningful route for your local food recovery organization or a local composter who might have not known that value was there.
That's awesome. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Samantha. It's been a pleasure having you. We're excited to continue to work with you and help you guys at the World Wildlife Fund to solve this problem and take steps in the right direction. So thank you for joining us. Is there any, one last question before you jump off, is there anything that you are excited about going forward? Is there any new innovations coming along? Anybody listening, something that you think that they should dive deeper into? You've already mentioned some great resources. You still there, Samantha? I don't know if we can still hear you.
Hell yes. So I'd say, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you now.
Yep.
Yay. Okay. I was like, oh no, we're losing the very last question. I think that's a great point, Stephen. So there's a lot of areas, whatever's getting you excited about this topic, I'd say dive in more. I'm like a waste nerd. So I was actually really jazzed about waste segregation and these things. Most people are not jazzed most about that. Instead, there's so many amazing culinary explorations, experiments you can do at home with your kids. My parents now have a really abundant garden, and they've been canning for the first time. Canning is so easy. And it's actually so fun to realize how much you can produce just out of your backyard or just canning. And it doesn't take a lot of investment, especially just canning or preserving something at home. So I definitely suggest taking a look at that and just stay dialed in on innovations. I mean, at-home composters are very expensive right now for residences, but this technology is going to get cheaper and cheaper. And we're hearing a lot of really cool innovations of folks having systems right in their home where they're able to digest or compost their food waste in just a couple days, use it to grow countertop tomatoes or use it out in their garden or for their communities. So I have a feeling, you know, what makes me hopeful and excited is that more and more folks are coming to the table on this topic, realizing where their expertise and power can really fit in to advancing this mission and working on this problem and all of the relative problems that intersect with it. So I'd say wherever you're getting excited, just lean in. There's a lot of fun to be had if you can get creative in some ways.
Amazing. Well, Samantha, we are forever in your debt. You know, thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for being so engaging and upbeat. You know, there are a lot of science communicators who aren't nearly as exciting and enthusiastic as yourself. And we feel incredibly lucky to have had you on here and to be able to use the EarthUP platform to be able to support your work and the work of all the other incredible people working in sustainability. So thank you so much.
I really appreciate you both. I appreciate the work you're doing and everyone who dialed in and is interested in having a part to play in building better systems for everyone.
Thanks, Samantha.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Hunter.